You're listening to the story. They offered money for her virginity, but a loner rancher locked the door and drew his gun. In a lawless land where women were sold and silence ruled, one nun chose to run. But when the desert gave her nothing but dust and danger, fate led her to a man who had locked his past away until justice knocked on his door with a loaded gun. The desert sun rose like a fiery omen, burning the horizon and casting long, cruel shadows across the cracked earth. A lone figure on horseback cut through the morning heat, her white habit stained with dust and sweat. Sister Evangeline gripped the reins tightly, her knuckles white, her heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the sound of hooves behind her. They were still chasing her. 3 riders trailed at a calculated distance, never too far, like wolves circling an injured doe. They were waiting for the right moment. Evangeline didn't have much left. Her horse was faltering, foam streaking its mouth, its stride uneven, but she urged it on, whispering prayers that stuck to her tongue like sand. The day before, she had fled the mission in Socorro, a place once sacred to her, now tainted. Colt Brazen had cornered her there in the chapel drunk, stinking of whiskey and sin. He made her an offer, if it could be called that. $200, he said, the smirk never leaving his lips. That's what they'll pay to have one night with an angel. She slapped him. Sound cracked across the chapel walls like gunfire. Brazen didn't flinch. He only smiled wider. Nobody refuses Colt Brazen. She'd run then, packing what little she could carry, taking the mission's only horse. She didn't stop to look back now at the altar, not at the cross, not at the life she was leaving behind. The desert stretched ahead endlessly, with nothing but dry brush, jagged hills, and the occasional gnarled Joshua tree. She had no destination, only the desperate hope that somewhere out there, man might still care more about honor than gold. Her gaze snagged on a wooden sign, half buried in dust. Carver Ranch to 2 miles. Trespassers will be shot. It was a risk, but it was her only chance. Behind her, the sound of hooves quickened. Her pursuers were closing in. She urged her horse forward, past the point of mercy, past the point of prayer. The creature gave one final push before collapsing beneath her, with a pitiful cry. Evangeline hit the ground hard, skinning her palms and splitting her lip. Blood and dirt mingled on her face as she stumbled to her feet and ran toward the ranch buildings. She could barely see ahead. She didn't know who lived there. Didn't know if the owner was the kind of man who would help or the kind who'd see her as a payday. But she had to believe. She had to hope. Thaddius Carver heard the gunshots before he saw the riders. In the stillness of a remote desert morning, you could hear trouble coming from miles away. He sat on his porch, a battered rifle across his lap, and squinted into the sun-bleached horizon. Trouble, it seemed, had found him again. He'd built this ranch 15 miles from the nearest town for one reason: peace. After losing his wife, Martha, and their unborn child to fever 5 years ago, he hadn't wanted company, conversation, or conflict. The silence suited him. He dulled the grief. Then he saw her, a woman in white, streaked with sweat and desert. Dust stumbled toward his house. Her habit flapped like a torn flag in the wind, and her face, young, bleeding, terrified, snapped something deep inside him back to life. She wasn't running anymore. She was barely staying upright. 3 riders followed at a predator's pace, content in the knowledge that their quarry had nowhere left to flee. The woman reached his porch, just as the lead rider crested the ridge. "Please," she gasped, gripping the porch railing. "They're going to kill me." Thaddius stood slowly, his shadow falling over her like a shield. "Who are they?" he asked. She could barely speak, her voice hoarse from heat and fear. "Colt Brazen. He wants to sell me," said. No one would stop him. That name punched a hole straight through Thaddius.com. Brazen was infamous across the territory, ran with a crew that left settlements, smoldering, and families broken. He was a man who took what he wanted and laughed at the ruins he left behind. Thaddius looked past the woman, beyond the edge of his porch, to the men on horseback. The one in front had a black beard and silver spurs that caught the light. His smile was lazy and assured the look of someone who had never once been denied. "Sister Evangeline," Brazen called, spreading his arms. "No need to run anymore. Just come back so we can talk. We're all friends here." Evangeline pressed herself against the porch railing. Her whole body trembled. Thaddius didn't move his hand toward his revolver. Not yet. But his fingers twitched with old memory. Brazen might have come for the nun, but his posture, the way he scanned the land, told a deeper story. He was already thinking about the ranch, defensible, valuable. Thaddius stepped off the porch. His boots thudded in the dry dirt. "This is private property," he said. "Stake your business or ride on." Brazen chuckled, nudging his horse closer. "Well, looks like our little sister found herself a protector. Name's Colt Brazen. Maybe you've heard of me." "Can't say I have." Thaddius lied. His heart pounded. One Isserni wasn't just here for a runaway nun. He was probing for weakness. Brazen's smile widened. "She owes me, you know. Ran off after assaulting me. That's a debt in my books. She says you tried to force yourself on her in a chapel." The smile cracked. Brazen's eyes turned cold. "She broke something valuable when she slapped me my reputation. But I'm a generous man. Hand her over, and I'll walk away." Thaddius didn't blink. "And if I say no, then things get unpleasant." Behind him, Evangeline whispered, "Don't. Please don't risk your life for me." But Thaddius had already made his choice. The last time he stayed silent, he buried his wife. He wasn't going to watch another innocent fall because of his hesitation. He took another step forward and placed himself squarely between Brazen and Cant. "The nun, you ride out of here now," he said, "or we find out just how generous you really are." Silence fell, thick and stifling. Brazen's companions shifted in their saddles, hands near holsters. They were ready for a fight. Then Brazen laughed again, but there was no humor left in it. "I was hoping you'd say that," he muttered. He raised a hand, and the other riders began to fan out, circling like wolves around a campfire. Thaddius' stomach tightened. This wasn't a dispute over a woman. This was a planned takeover. Evangeline clutched his arm. "He's going to kill us both," he whispered back, without looking away from Brazen. "When I tell you, run to the barn. There's a rifle above the stalls. I've never fired one. Point and shoot. The Lord will guide the rest." Brazen's voice rang out again. "This ranch sits in a sweet spot between Socorro and Las Cruces. You know how much money man could make moving goods through here? All I need is to remove the current owner. Adieu." He pointed at Evangeline. "You'll fetch a good price too." Evangeline gasped. Thaddius felt fire rise in his chest. He had no illusions about survival. These men were killers. But he also knew this. If he handed her over, he'd lose more than his land. He'd lose the last shred of himself. Worth saving. He turned to her one last time. "Run." Evangeline didn't hesitate. At Thaddius' command, she bolted from the porch, gathering her skirts and sprinting toward the barn. Her bare feet kicked up clouds of dust as she ran, heart hammering in her chest. The first gunshot cracked like lightning. Thaddius had fired. The bullet slammed into the chest of Brazen's horse. The animal screamed and reared, throwing its rider to the dirt in a chaotic tumble. Brazen hit hard, his weapon flying from his grip and vanishing into the dust. But his men were already moving. The one on the left, a scar-faced outlaw with lifeless eyes, raised his rifle toward the running nun. Thaddius pivoted and fired, again clean, sharp, practiced. A second bullet struck the gunman square in the chest. spitting him from the saddle like a broken doll. The third rider, younger man, with a cruel sneer charged forward, aiming his pistol low. His horse's hooves thundered as he galloped straight for the house. Thaddius dove behind a water trough, bullets shredding the air where he'd stood just a second before. Inside the barn, Evangeline had thrown herself behind a pile of hay bales, gasping for breath. She spotted the rifle exactly where Thaddius had said it would be, hanging above the stalls. With shaking hands, she pulled it down, nearly dropping it in the process. Back outside, Thaddius peeked over the edge of the trough and saw Brazen crawling across the ground toward his fallen weapon, blood trickling down his forehead. The outlaw's eyes burned with pure hatred. One bullet left. Thaddius's fingers hovered over the cylinder of his revolver. Time slowed. 3 enemies, 1 shot, and no guarantees. Another shot rang out, but this time, not his. The young rider, who had been circling the ranch house, suddenly jerked upright in his saddle. Blood blossomed across his shirt as he slumped forward and toppled to the ground with a dull thud. From the barn came Evangeline's voice, high, shaking, but unmistakably fierce. "I got him. God, I actually got him." A surge of pride rose in Thaddius's chest. The nun had steel in her spine, but there was no time to celebrate. Brazen's fingers curled around his dropped revolver. With a groan, he lifted it, staggering to his feet, face twisted in pain and fury. "You killed my boys," he roared. "I'll make you both pay for that." Thaddius rose and fired his final shot. Ta-da! The bullet hit Brazen in the shoulder, spinning him halfway around, but it didn't drop him. The man screamed, but held onto his weapon, stumbling toward the barn where Evangeline was hidden. "Sister," Thaddius shouted. Dang, Brazen's pistol barked. The barn door splintered under the impact of his shots. Evangeline screamed, ducking behind a beam, clutching the rifle to her chest. Thaddius didn't know if she'd been hit. He sprinted across the yard, his heart thudding, diving behind an old wagon. He heard Brazen's boots thudding closer, followed by another terrible sound, the scrape of metal against wood as Brazen shoved the barn door open. The nun had nowhere left to run, but then another crack of gunfire. Brazen staggered. He turned, confused, then crumpled to his knees. A neat hole bloomed in his temple, just above his left eye. Behind him, Evangeline stood in the open doorway, her hands trembling, smoking rifle still raised to her shoulder. She had pulled the trigger. The yard fell silent, except for the ragged sound of her breathing. Then the rifle clattered from her hands, and she dropped to her knees, staring at the bodies around her. Thaddius walked slowly toward her. Broken glass crunched beneath his boots from the shattered windows of the house. He saw her expression, haunted, hollow. "I killed them," she whispered. "I took human lives." "Okay." He knelt beside her, lowering his voice. "You defended yourself," he said gently. "You defended me. There's no sin in that." "I'm a nun," she said, voice cracking. "I'm supposed to heal, to forgive, and sometimes," he replied, "doing God's work means stopping evil with whatever tools you've got left." Evangeline looked into his eyes, and for the first time since arriving, there was a flicker of something else there. Not peace. Not yet. But maybe, just maybe, hope. Before either of them could say another word, they heard it. Distant hoofbeats. Many of them. A low rumble echoed across the valley from the north, growing louder by the second. Thaddius turned toward the hills and saw a dust cloud rising like a warning. They weren't done. Not even close. Thaddius lifted the spyglass from the porch and steadied his hand. Through the swirling dust, he could make out at least a dozen riders-armed men wearing wide-brimmed hats and bandoliers, fanning out like wolves across the canyon trail. "There, not Brazen's," he muttered. Evangeline, still pale from the firefight, steadied herself on a support beam. "Who are they?" Key lowered the glass. "Valdez, one of the worst. And if he's here, that means this wasn't some random chase. This was coordinated." Evangeline blinked. You think Brazen was just the first wave? Thaddius nodded grimly. This land's too valuable. You control the pass through this valley. You control trade between half a dozen settlements. They want this ranch. She looked around at the house, the barn, the quiet fields carved from desert. Then we have to run. I'm not leaving without a plan. Together, they gathered what they could: ammunition, water, dried provisions, saddled Thaddius's strongest horse, a muscular black gelding named Thunder. The distant hoofbeats grew louder by the second. There's an old silver. Mine, Thaddius said, strapping a rifle across his back. It's abandoned for years. Tight passages, lots of tunnels, but only one way in or out. It's a trap, Evangeline said. He nodded. It's also shelter. They rode hard for the canyon, skirting the edge of the valley as Valdez's men spread out behind them. When they reached the mine entrance, Thaddius quickly dismounted and led Thunder inside. Checking the support beams and testing the darkness with the lantern, the smoke was the first sign of Valdez's plan. From deep inside the mine, they could hear voices outside. The outlaws were stacking brush and timber near the entrance. They're going to smoke us out, Thaddius said. They'll burn us alive. Or wait until we come out choking. Evangeline paced, eyes scanning the narrow shafts. We can't just wait here. I could sneak out, Thaddius offered. Draw them away. You stay with the horse and cover the exit. No, she shook her head. You're the better shot. They get through, you'll have a chance. I'm smaller, faster. I might be able to slip past their perimeter. He hesitated. Trust me, she said softly. If I don't make it, at least one of us needs to. He looked at her, not as a frightened nun, not even as the woman he had defended, but as someone with courage carved into her bones. They clasped hands briefly. Then Evangeline slipped into one of the narrow escape tunnels. Smoke began curling into the mine entrance. Thaddius moved deeper, coughing against a bitter sting in his lungs, keeping Thunder calm while occasionally firing shots toward the mouth of the mine to keep up the illusion that both of them were still inside. Then, chaos, gunfire erupted from the canyon outside, not aimed at the mine, but at Valdez's men. Shouts rang out, screams. The sudden burst of violence echoed off the canyon walls like thunder. Thaddius dashed toward the entrance, choking on smoke. As he reached the edge, the air shifted, and the light outside glowed red from fire and blood. And then he saw her. Evangeline stood at the far end of the canyon, her face streaked with ash and defiance. She had led a counter-dash ambush. Behind her came riders' neighbors from the surrounding valleys, ranchers and townsfolk responding to her desperate plea. She'd made it. She hadn't just escaped. She'd returned with help. Valdez turned, enraged. You cost me everything, he shouted, eyes locked with Thaddius across the canyon floor. My men, my plans, my reputation. Good, Thaddius spat. Mounting Thunder, they charged toward each other like ghosts of the frontier, two men shaped by violence and the brutal justice of the land. Valdez fired first. His bullet grazed Thaddius's ribs, tearing flesh. But Thaddius's return shot struck true center mass. Valdez was thrown from his horse, gasping, defeated. It was over. But Evangeline didn't relax. She stood in the middle of the canyon, rifle lowered, breath steady. Around her, the other ranchers began mopping up, disarming the remaining outlaws. Thaddius rode to her side. You did it, he said. She smiled faintly. I only lit the signal. K came because they wanted to believe someone would stand. Key looked around at the faces of those who had risked everything. It's farmers, women, even a preacher holding a musket. This wasn't just defense, it was revolution. The dust hadn't yet settled over the canyon floor when the sounds of war began to fade. Dismounted riders helped one another patch wounds. Some wept over fallen comrades. Others simply sat in silence, too drained to speak, but for Thaddius and Evangeline, something deeper had shifted. They stood side by side at the center of it all, surrounded by the evidence of a fight no one wanted, but none had been willing to avoid. Evangeline looked down at her torn habit, stained with blood and ash. "I never imagined I'd end up here," she murmured. "Not as a soldier." Thaddius nodded. "None of us did." In the hours that followed, as the surviving outlaws were rounded up and the dead given quick desert burials, something remarkable began to happen. Word spread among the local ranchers how Thaddius Carver had stood against Brazen, how Sister Evangeline had escaped a siege and returned with help, how their combined courage had stopped Valdez from seizing control of the entire region. No lawmen had come. No cavalry had ridden to save them. They'd done it alone, together by sundown. The porch of Carver Ranch was crowded with neighbors, some familiar, others strangers. One by one, they spoke of uniting, a cooperative, a defense league, mutual protection in a land where justice was often too slow or too far to matter. They turned to Thaddius. "You've got the land," one man said. "You've got the sense and the grit. We need someone to lead." Thaddius shook his head at first. "I came out here to be alone, but you stayed and fought," a woman added. "You've already led, whether you meant to or not." He looked to Evangeline, whose eyes held both encouragement and quiet understanding. "They need you," she whispered, "and maybe you need them eventually." He agreed, not for power, but for purpose. For Martha, who had once told him, "A man who won't stand for what's right isn't worth marrying." That night, the first outlines of a new kind of community took shape, one not bound by fear, but by resolve. Weeks passed. Carver Ranch, once a quiet place of sorrow and solitude, transformed into something far greater. The barn was rebuilt, the porch repainted. Outposts and signal fires were established in the surrounding valleys, ensuring that no one would ever stand alone again. Evangeline stayed. She never returned to the mission in Socorro. There was work to be done, here real work. She turned a corner of the barn into a chapel, open to all. She led prayer services for ranchers and drifters alike, but she also organized patrols, trained in self-defense, and helped manage supply routes between the cooperative's homesteads. Some whispered about her and Thaddius, how they walked the fields together at dusk, shared stories over coffee in the early dawn, but they kept boundaries. There was no need to explain themselves. What they had was built on mutual respect, forged in fire and fear, and ultimately faith. She no longer prayed only for peace. She prayed for courage, for justice, for strength, and for those who could not pray for themselves. One morning, Thaddius found Evangeline in the chapel, rearranging supplies for the defense patrols. She looked up and smiled. "You look rested," she said. "I slept," he replied. "Didn't think I would again. Not after everything." "Okay, me neither." He paused. "You think it'll hold?" "What we've built?" Eyes drifted out the window toward the hills. "Maybe, maybe not. But at least now, they'll have to fight for every inch." He looked at her hands, once trembling, now steady. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if I turned you away that day?" "Every day," she said quietly. "I think about what would have happened to me and to you." They didn't speak after that. They didn't need to. In that moment, the silence between them was not emptiness, it was understanding. As the seasons turned, the legend of Carver Ranch grew. It became a symbol throughout the territory, not just of resistance, but of what could be built when people stopped waiting for help and decided to help each other. Travelers came. Some stayed. Others carried the story onward. And in the heart of it all, Evangeline and Thaddius stood not as saints or heroes, but as reminders that sometimes the line between grace and grit is thinner than we think. that faith doesn't always wear robes, and that even in the harshest deserts, hope can still bloom.